Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about, you know, Black tech and why it matters. I tell you a little bit about myself. To start, I'm a technology director at Capital One, building and scaling platforms in the fintech space there. And I've also held tech leadership roles in pharma, building drug development platforms and tech startups. I've played a lot in that space. I had one specifically, Jamity. I was a social media sentiment aggregation platform, and this was back in 2010 before social media was had really taken off and sort of hit the mark with influences and so forth. Figured out the product, didn't quite figure out the scale, and most recently, founder at Spectus, where we think a lot and develop technology, for our community, right? Now, this term Black tech, right? I want to talk a bit about that. And this is something that happens when our community develops our own solutions to the systemic problems that we face, right? These are homegrown solutions to things like mass incarceration, wealth and income inequality, and as well as the topic of definitely the national topic of conversation and the topic for today, which is community policing. So on the panel with me today are two great friends of mine, Antoinette Toll and Richard Robinson. And they're both leaders in the fields of technology and community policing, respectively. Richard, would you like to give an intro?
Yeah, how you doing, everyone? Richard Robinson, founder of WebDMG. I'm also director of mobility and software development at GlaxoSmithKline healthcare company. I've developed a couple of nonprofits with my amazing wife, Mary Robinson, called Hack for Community, where we help deliver instruction and understanding of careers in technology to underserved communities. I'm also on the board of Black Tech Philly, which is an up-and-coming tech startup group in the Philadelphia area. I have my master's degree in information systems. I've been a developer for +years. I've helped develop different platforms in the healthcare space. I've developed platforms in the private business space. And I've also done a considerable amount of consulting to mostly Black startups and Black small businesses, helping them understanding how technology can help their business move to the next level. And I've also developed and built a Black-owned podcast hosting platform called Casting.
All right, thanks, Richard. Antoinette, could you give an intro, please?
Sure. My name is Antoinette Tull. Like Dean said, first I'd like to thank you, Dean, and the conference organizers for having me. It's an honor to be a part of this conference, especially because I know I am the least technically inclined person in this virtual room. But just briefly about my background and just so everyone will have an understanding of who I am. And I'm going to go back along. I'm going back. In 1991, after I saw the televised version of the vicious beating of Rodney King, I decided that I did not like law. I decided that this country's criminal justice system was rigged, and I didn't want to have any part of it. And I made the physical decision or the mental decision to not like police. In 2001, I started working in the city of Richmond in our social services office, and my HR director called me a couple of years in and asked me what I thought about working for the police department. I said I don't think about it at all, and I hung up. Needless to say, he won that argument, and I was transferred in, but I left shortly, about 8 months into working in the police department. I left. I did return, and I returned at the request of a new chief who was implementing community-oriented policing. At that time, I had about 10 years experience in human resources. And today, I've been in the role as the HR chief for the Richmond, Virginia Police Department for about 13 years. Luckily, I get to oversee areas of action like recruitment and staffing, legal compliance, organizational development, risk management, and employee relations, which includes our disciplinary review office. So while our chief of police makes the final decision, the strength of that recommendation to hire police officers in our departments or to terminate them in our department is powerful. And it comes from me, and it comes from all of the data that my team compiles in order to make those decisions. So today I'm here as a call to action. Today I'm here to say I understand what's happening in our community. We've experienced it in our community, and I absolutely believe that Black tech is going to be the key to the reimagination of community and law enforcement reform.
Thank you so much, Antoinette. I think that you know, that was a really powerful call to action. I know you and I have this conversation all the time, and I just wanted to kick it off by posing the obvious question to you. All right, we see what's going on. It's a bit frustrating, and so we want to talk about these opportunities and solutions. What are those opportunities, though, in the public safety space that we should be looking at from your perspective?
So, what I will say is most pressing is to have people involved, people of color. Police electronic data systems, if you do a Google search of them right now, the majority of them will say made by cops for cops. And so inherently, these systems are biased because we lack the people in law enforcement in terms of diversity, especially women of color. But we lack that diversity on the law enforcement side, but we also lack that diversity on the technology side. I have been in the room when we've wanted to purchase certain things, such as ShotSpotter, some of the big ones that are Exxon, big police technology companies. And there may be one or two people who look like myself. Typically, there's no one that looks like me. African American females, there's typically not many of us in the room, if any at all. And Black males, we lack a role at the table when the decisions are being made. In HR, whenever I know I need something, the first thing we do is a needs assessment. I'm not sure what you call it technically, but we do a needs assessment. What is our goal? How do we get there? And what do we need to get there? But we're not in the room to make that happen. And so when we're looking at the data on the other side, it's not there to reflect things that we need in our community to be reflected, such as
Right.
demographic.
Right. You know what? One of the things that was interesting to me when we discussed this, Antoinette, was it seemed like the solutions appear to be in more of the data space. I think you mentioned a few systems that could be built or that are lacking, or that our input into the development of those systems, would be paramount in sort of having a shift here. Can you talk a bit about some of those systems?
Absolutely. I just want us to be all clear when we leave this room. All of the systems in law enforcement and criminal justice need Black tech. You don't leave with anything else. Understand that. But one of the key things is what we call our early warning systems. So these are early intervention systems about discipline and what happens with officers in the disciplinary process. We've seen the media, we've seen the news stories. They're all heartbreaking, and we're waiting and sitting on the edge of our seats for that criminal charge, which is separate and apart from what I'm talking about. But we're waiting for those criminal charges to occur. But there's also an administrative piece. Sometimes we get lost on the fact that police officers are employees of an organization. And our early warning systems are typically in our internal affairs departments or professional standards units. And what happens is it captures police violations of conduct. So use of force, respect, abuse of positions, insubordinations, late for duties, all of those types of code of conduct things are actually captured in the system. The problem is if in fact there are trends in behavior, bias trends in behavior, that information isn't tracked
Hmm.
because whoever sat at the table to create those didn't think about that type of trending behavior that we see now in our use of force concerns.
Right.
So when we're at the table, we can say, hey, demographics needs to be up front. And I'll give you an example. I had an officer here. The officer was a 10-year officer. The officer has 5 complaints by women for rudeness, respect. One of the last complaints, and he received progressive discipline for those, but those are very minor disciplinary actions on our scale. The last violation of policy he had was a social media policy. And
Mm-hmm.
so, of course, we reviewed all of that in the investigation and found that he hated African American women. He hated African American women who were women who had children and they were unmarried. And he consistently posted this on social media. What was heartbreaking is that that was one of his primary areas. We did not capture the data and the demographics of the complainant. We only captured their names. So
Gotcha.
without that data, being able to input that information or having someone at the table to say, this is what we need to see in order to do an analysis of a bias trend, it's not there.
Wow.
And
Gotcha.
I
Mm,
don't,
mm.
in sitting, and in sitting at these tables, to be honest, I'm going to think about it, right? And this system was built long before me, and money is also a determining factor in jurisdictions. But when we're at the table, those individuals don't have those experiences. So they don't look like us. They won't understand what that means. It's
Mm.
so important for us to be in the room when that all happens.
Definitely. That is
That makes
so
sense?
interesting. No, it makes total sense to me. And I think, I echo the sentiments that I'm seeing on the chat here is basically, wow, there's a few things that pop into mind, but I'd love to, Richard, are there, if you look at these types of problems, right, these type of data problems, even opportunities in pulling together data around these officers, there was extra data, maybe on social media profiles and so forth that could have been used to understand a bit more of the context. Are there solutions to these problems that you see in the space, or even that are being developed in the community?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dean. One of the things that you're starting to see, especially in this current environment, is that citizens, and people in the community are starting to take action themselves and starting to put together their own data sets. I think it's really interesting when you start getting into crowdsourcing and things like that, because there's a project called We the Protesters, and they've started to compile a database of all of the police involved shootings across the country, right? You start taking information like that, and then there's another project called the WNC project, where they talk about whether the disciplinary history of an officer, whether it's confidential, public, or limited in its availability to the public. And I think these use cases where people in our community are starting to put these projects together, and they're starting to even go to policy, right, and work on policies that allow it to be legal to record officers, right? Because the issue with a data problem is the first step in data is collection, right?
Hmm.
So we have to have ways to collect this data before we can take action on this data. So even some of the community projects, like with Campaign Zero, they have a couple of projects there where they're working on dealing with the policy of recording a police officer, or how to document these incidents. And
Hmm.
now once we start being able to collect that data, then we should it would be, to our advantage as a community to start compiling that data in databases. And
Hmm.
one more thing, in the We Protest project, where they have the police shooting database, that database is open source, so you can download that database and start to add other data points to it. So I think the situation is very ripe for some data scientists from our community to show up and actually start putting the community's um, influence on how these data sets are used. I think the only hurdle we have is, I think scale is not the hurdle that we have. It's how do we get these, once we have these data sets, how do we give them to a net and get them into the police department's hands, where they can then take action and help
Hmm.
form internal policies based on the data that's being collected.
Right, right. One of the things that's gotten me thinking about, right? We can sort of swarm together as a community and collect this data. And Antoinette, talk a bit about how do we keep that from being adversarial in nature, and how do we partner sort of at the community level with the department to sort of build more structure around that and actually leverage the data for the outcomes.
So I think right about now, which is why I said this is a call to action. Right about now, I believe everyone is listening. Everyone is paying attention. Do I believe everyone agrees? No. Do I believe there are a lot of people that want things to just, okay, finish marching so that we can go back to status quo? Absolutely. There are, agencies and people who have that, type of mindset. But I think the majority of departments understand that it has to change. It is changing, and there shall be change. What's unique about my role is that after George Floyd, I have I get to speak around the country about recruitment, retention, law, HR, risk management, and law enforcement. And what is unique about what happened after George Floyd is that the majority of the chiefs of police that I know around the country, Black and white and Hispanic, they were all utterly upset
Mm-hmm,
and angry about what transpired with George
mm-hmm,
Floyd. And they were willing to say that vocally, not only to their communities, but to their staff. And so that right there was already a change that I could see.
mm-hmm,
This Breonna Taylor issue, same thing. Everyone is like, wait a minute, hold on. There really is a problem. So the ears are there. In order to get it there and partner and not make it adversarial, you have to show they're just like everyone else, which is why I ended up coming back. They're humans. Make them understand what it means for them. This will reduce the bias in this will help you become more transparent, or will provide better engagement. There is
mm-hmm,
nothing wrong with a police misconduct app. If and real talk, I was at a perf conference last December 2019, and the question became, should we, and this is a room of about 500 people, again, maybe there were 5 of us that looked like me, and the question on the floor was, should we recruit from the Black Lives Matter movement? I'm,
mm-hmm,
you know, I'm first one up, like, why not? Tell me why not. Because they are against police brutality. Everyone in this room, which were all chiefs and officers, we should be against police brutality. So that should not be a
mm-hmm,
question on the floor. So
mm-hmm.
if you help them understand that, Megan, if you help them understand that the transparency and the engagement of the app is what is going to allow them to better engage with their community and do their jobs and build that trust and legitimacy, then that's a win for the department.
Right.
And the ones who are not, and I'll tell you this, the ones who are not on board with that, go to your legislator. A lot of, what I wanted to go back real quick, and I don't want to keep talking, but to what Richard said about data collection, go to your legislator. Make sure, it matters when you're working with your state to understand the laws about data collection and about what is private and what is not. Because that way you can build it to that. You can build it to whatever legally you are required to build it to. And if you have a general counsel, if you have a legal liaison in your company, then you can actually work and partner with your state representation to question whether or not it legitimately should be in your code to not have that type of information.
Right.
Very information, yes, it's very taboo, but that information can still be subpoenaed.
Right. Now that's interesting. Richard, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the conversation that we had on the VR side. That struck me as interesting. Uh, Opportunities for using VR in virtual
Yeah.
reality in the police space. Maybe Richard, if you could elaborate a bit.
Yeah. With some of the new advancements in computing, and I'm sure everyone at this conference understands some of those advancements, right? We're able to do a lot more things in real time or near real time as far as rendering out scenarios, things like that. And I think one of the things that VR brings to that engagement is, that immersive feeling, right? Because you have the headset on, your ears are covered, your eyes are covered, and you can be immersed in a situation where I think using, some AI and machine learning or something like that, you would be able to create these adverse scenarios and test officers or anyone in the public space, right? Anybody that renders services to the public or is a public servant, you could put them in some adverse situations, and because the tech is at that level, we'll be able to do it near real time, or the setup wouldn't be a 3-day setup where you have to have a special facility. You could have an Oculus or the headset that's used by HP, and be able to put these officers in these situations. And even if you go a step further and you're doing it while they're connected to maybe a EKG or something like that, so you could see what their heart rate's like, see what their blood pressure's like, things like that. You're getting into a real deep understanding of not only the psychological reaction, but the physiological reaction to these adverse situations, which I think would be a huge step forward. But to Antoinette's point, sometimes budget becomes issues, things like that. So that's where it's on us as tech professionals to find ways to lower those costs, create it as a SaaS service, different things like that becomes those outcomes, because then you can show up and say, if 50 police departments are putting into this, then the cost for one particular metro drops exponentially versus them fronting the cost altogether, right? Because in the VR space, we can win with software instead of having to fight with the hardware, because someone else has kind of done that for us, which I think is a really big step forward.
Right. And, well, the big question there as well, it is for Antoinette, and it's coming from the chat, but it's a good segue. How is there funding, right, within the department for this? And if sort of the community, you got a ton of software engineers here, if they wanted to participate in that type of thing, right, is there actually a tech department at the within the police force to do this, right? Are we even looking in that direction as from a transformational perspective?
So yes, and yes, and yes, and yes. Police departments, most police departments that are larger, I would say larger than 500 people, they have their own tech department. In Richmond, we have our own tech department. We have our own HR department. We have our own financial management department. We have those things available to us. But again, it's very hard when you're day to day working to be transformational. Transformational thinking really, unfortunately, in this culture, we are transactional a lot of the time. You have to intentionally decide to be transformational. And so the money can be there if there is someone at the table, again, who's interested in being transformational. Leadership in the city, I will always say, if you're going to work with your local jurisdictions, then you want to start with the city administration and the procurement process first. Once you start there, then you can get into the departments. Sometimes we've had people reach out to us and we've had to shuffle them over to the procurement department, but there's money there. And again, I think right now, Black tech, everyone knows that that is what's going to be needed in order for us to reimagine the criminal justice system in totality, not just law enforcement, but it in totality. There is funding available. I believe that state and federal legislatures are going to make funding available. I believe that there are going to be grants that are available. If you listen to, and I haven't been able to listen to the news for a variety of reasons right about now. Probably not until the election is over, but there's a variety of organizations that are looking at grant funds and private funds to help the police department reimagine what it's about to do with technology. We know it's needed. It's a matter of bringing everything together now.
What's being done to make sure the community, though, is a part of that? Because I don't see it as a journey in which the police department or the state legislator, city legislation can walk alone. What's being done to pull the community into that process?
So right now we have it, and it's happening pretty much across the country. Most of the jurisdictions have a task force that's been assigned by the administration. We only have two people. I think there's over 20 people on our task force. We only have two representatives on there, and they are there just to talk about what we currently have in policy, what we currently do, and they are not a part of the reimagination, if you will. They are really solely there to tell them what we're currently doing now and how we can build on that in the future, or how they can build on that. So we've
Hmm.
gotten the community involved that way. But I just want us to show up.
Hmm.
I get defund the police. I understand everything about the defund the police. Trust me, I work here, I be here. I'm like, oh, I get why they say defund the police. I am more of a let's really, really think about how we're reallocating funds, how we are using these funds, because
Hmm.
the political stuff that comes with funding for police departments is huge.
Hmm.
And so, when you look at your jurisdiction and they have military vehicles, someone should have showed up at city council. Someone
Right.
should have showed up and said, why are we purchasing this?
Right.
And it's
Mm-hmm.
easier for us to do now because it's virtual.
Right.
We got to
Right.
show up. We got to ask those questions. When that money is going to something that we know isn't appropriate for our community, we have to be there from the ground up. And
Right.
Mm-hmm.
that's in all of the spaces.
Right. Right.
And
Now, Richard.
and
Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, I like to add something to that because I think one call out that I think is very important is understanding who is policing your community, right? Because think about it, we have medical records that are digitized, we have dental records that are digitized. I can look up and see if a doctor had a complaint filed against them. I can find out if a school teacher has had a complaint filed against them, but doing the same thing to understanding that officer who patrols my neighborhood is nigh impossible a lot of times. So I think showing up to, like Antoinette was saying, showing up to the city council meetings and things like that and putting that as an issue on the table not only becomes, a solution in itself, but then it also opens the door to some of these tech solutions to have a meaningful impact, right? Because once that's on the table and they say, okay, now we want to be able to have this tracking system of officer misconduct that goes from department to department so they can't just switch counties and get a job back, right? Then how do we implement that? So that then becomes, now we've got it on the table politically, and then we can show up with the technical solution to solve the problem using some of our data gathering techniques that we talked about on this call even.
Hmm.
So I think that's
Richard,
hugely important.
that actually is the decertification process, in which an officer, his misconduct, removes him from the ability to be an officer. We're actually, that has been a push, small push, to get that as a national database. And I'm hopeful that is something that I've been pushing for as well, because that is needed. We have had officers who apply to us and they've come from other jurisdictions, and I'm like, not here, not on my watch.
Mm-hmm.
And I have several friends who look like me, who are in law enforcement, who understand what that means when we can read that. Most law enforcement agencies go to the other jurisdiction to see someone's disciplinary record. It's not something that's done over the phone like a regular background check. They actually go through, they go see, they request the records in those eye investigations. But if you look like, there are real things in HR like the affinity bias, the beauty bias. Those are real biases that we all have. And so when you think about, that this industry and the culture of for cops by cops, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
get that type of decision at the end with no accountability. So
Right.
creating a system in which those people are not able to get into law enforcement again, a
Mm-hmm.
national level,
Right.
that will be most beneficial to our community.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Definitely. I think, we have our call to action here. What we wanted to do was sort of have this conversation and spark thought. We have, thousands of technologists listening to this talk. And I think, some of the areas that we talked about, this being a data problem,
Mm-hmm.
or partially a data problem that we
Mm-hmm.
can look at from a solution perspective using biometrics and training, live scenarios, decertification process that the community could participate in, using novel solutions such as VR as well. I think there's just a ton of opportunity, with or without funding, that folks here and others that are inspired could participate in. So, thanks for exploring the topic and giving us the insights, Antoinette, Richard.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Yep.
Thanks again. Everybody keep the conversation going. Reach out to us if you'd like to discuss this topic further. And thanks for your time.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
everyone.
All right.